Jurassic Park wasn't new to me the night that we watched it at my grandparents' house next door. We'd already seen it in theaters. When it came out on VHS, which, if you're under 30, was a commitment. We were so excited to watch it with them. No skips, no pauses, no algorithm deciding you're done. But what I remember most isn't the dinosaurs. No, it was my grandma. Every time someone got a little too close to danger, a dark hallway, a locked door, a decision that clearly required less confidence and more common sense, she'd sit up and yell at the TV. I know! Honey! Don't go in there! I know! Vieja! What are they doing? Stupid! Over and over. For 2 hours. At some point, we just stopped watching the movie. You'd have too. Honestly, she was way more entertaining. It wasn't like she was reacting to the dinosaurs. It was the harebrained decisions characters made. The moment when someone ignores the warning, trusts the system, assumes control, and steps forward anyway. Idiotas. It was funny at the time. I mean, it still is. Like, Grandma, eres tan dramática. Chill. But years later, sitting in a theater watching Death of a Unicorn, I had this deeply annoying realization about a quarter of the way through. We keep making this same damn movie. Told ya. I'm a movie buzzkill. Different decade, different cast, same confidence, same shortcuts, same belief that because it once worked, it will keep working. And suddenly, my grandma's voice doesn't feel funny anymore. Because the first sign that something is about to change forever isn't chaos. It's not a disaster montage. It's not a trending hashtag. It's the moment when someone is very clearly yelling, I know! Don't go in there! And everyone else keeps walking como que nunca han visto 100 millones de películas donde hacen lo mismo. Pendejos. This won't be your typical history lesson. Toss that dusty textbook out the door because these pages blaze a thread that runs through the ages. From the whispers of change to the roaring crescendos of today's mighty changemakers, this podcast tells the dynamic story of the unyielding spirit of progress and the people who refused to be silenced. Join me, Angelica Cordero, on this journey through our collective history to explore the pursuit and resistance of change. Fearless, uninterrupted, relentless. This is The Persistence. Episode 14. The World Keeps Turning. Not a lot had changed by the start of the 1960s. One thing was for certain, you could definitely feel the cracks the 1950s had left. A lot of the unrest at this moment didn't look political, yet. It looked personal. It showed up in kitchens, in classrooms, in dorm rooms, in the space between what people were told to want and what their bodies were starting to reject. That's what they get for eating all that green Jell-O salad. Suburban women finally had a name for their dissatisfaction in 1963, when the feminine mystique named the problem that has no name. That hollow, dead behind the eyes feeling of living a life that photographed beautifully for Christmas cards and felt like emotional asbestos. Restless, dissatisfied. Smiles on autopilot. Eyes already a little checked out. The 1,000-yard stare of people who were told this was happiness long enough to stop arguing with it. They weren't marching yet, but they were cratering. Well, not all of them. Queer and trans communities were ahead of the game. They had already created worlds of their own because, obviously, they had to, since the larger one refused to let them sit with us. God damn it, Gretchen. Quiet upstate New York houses like Casa Susana became havens for gender non-conforming people where they could dress, live, and sashay far, far away from the police, employers, and public punishment. If only for a weekend. And then there were other organizations like the Mattachine Society, formed in the 1950s to quietly organize, protect, and connect gay men long before Grindr and Republican conventions existed. Being openly queer was costly back then. You could lose your job, your freedom, or your life. This wasn't visibility politics yet. Pride pirates weren't a thing. There was no rainbow corporate branding. Sometimes it wasn't even about physical space. It was about language. Carson Kressley and the original Fab Five might have brought zhuzh into the mainstream in the early aughts. But queer communities had a full working vocabulary long before Queer Eye. Drag, butch, queen, duds, booze, and more. Slang older than the Marys and Mollys that predate Marie, Let Them Eat Cake, Antoinette, and trace a lineage far messier, wider, and more globally diverse than the United Colors of Benetton could have ever managed. I'm talking surly criminals, thieves, beggars, and hustlers from the 1500s Great British Empire. Polari offered queers a means to recognize each other, warn each other, and talk openly in public without being understood by the wrong ears. If you couldn't be safe, you could at least be legible to each other. Chosen families, underground spaces, new language, infrastructure designed to exist just outside the system's line of sight. This was survival. America might have been busy congratulating itself on opportunity, but access was still carefully gatekept with surgical precision. The GI Bill promised returning veterans a future, unless you were black or brown, in which case banks redlined, colleges stalled, and neighborhoods enforced segregation through community standards and racist HOAs that somehow always knew exactly who shouldn't be there. Segregation was still legal. Violence was routine. Eventually, had become a lifetime promise. And young people were done waiting. College campuses talked endlessly about democracy, freedom, and leadership while enforcing rigid hierarchies and unspoken rules about who belonged where. Civics classes celebrated freedom while skipping over who it excluded. You know, just minor details. Students were told to be patient, to wait their turn, to trust the process. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and have some avocado toast, which is always what systems say right before you realize the process is a scam. Wait, the stuff before the... No, not the Oh, never mind. Cold War drills taught children how to hide under desks from nuclear annihilation because apparently plywood and human shields counted as preparedness. Slowly, something began to shift. Not anger yet, not rebellion. Recognition, acknowledgement. That good behavior they'd been taught was starting to feel less like safety and more like emotional hostage-taking. Stillness works until it starts costing you something. This is the dangerous part of any system. When people haven't moved yet, they've stopped believing that staying put will save them. No marches, no slogans, no headlines, just bodies adjusting, learning that cooperation is not the same as consent, that patience can be used to control people, that obedience doesn't always mean order. Sometimes it just means silence. And when that realization spreads, it doesn't announce itself, it waits, right up until someone decides not to move.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience about this and other related incidents. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. Difficulties over segregation and discrimination exist in every city, in every state of the Union, producing in many cities a rising tide of discontent that threatens the public safety. Nor is this a partisan issue. In a time of domestic crisis, men of goodwill and generosity should be able to unite regardless of party or politics. This is not even a legal or legislative issue alone. It is better to settle these matters in the courts than on the streets, and new laws are needed at every level. But law alone cannot make men see right.
Close your eyes for a second. Unless you're driving, then please don't. My insurance won't cover you. Think of an animal. Something gentle, soft-eyed. You know, the kind that would never bite first. Feel its breath, shallow and careful. Feel the way it watches the world. It's always calculating, always waiting for the danger to pass. It's not numb, it's surviving. Then a shadow leans in too close. A hand moves too fast. The air does that Stranger Things, uh-oh, the upside down is opening shimmer. There's an electric buzz under its ribs. This isn't protection, it's control. The creature freezes, but just for a moment. Something deep inside stirs. It's ancestral, instinctual, written in its DNA. Not rage, recognition. Fear turns into clarity. The heart says, move. The body answers, now! That's the thing about animals. They freeze before they flee. Stillness keeps them safe until it starts feeling like you're cosplaying a doormat. Push anything far enough, an animal, a human, a millennial with 87 unread emails, and the body eventually goes, yeah, fuck this, I'm out. Not violently, not wildly, just instinctively. Most people don't get that nonviolence isn't passive. But in the animal world, stillness with intention is a deeply strategic, high-stakes survival behavior. It says, I am not a threat, but I will not run. You will have to confront your own actions against my presence. Mahatma Gandhi understood this long before the 1960s. Half a world away in 1940s British-controlled India, millions of people were living inside their own trapped-in-the-system nightmare. A whole country pressed into silence, taught that obedience was the only way to avoid brutal consequences. Gandhi wasn't a soldier or a king or someone with political power. He was a lawyer, believe it or not. A man of simple cloth who realized something radical. If an entire nation stops cooperating, well, power collapses, not the people. Gandhi didn't start with marches. He started with stillness, refusal, non-cooperation, occupying space without violence. And the British Empire, namely Churchill, didn't know what to do with that. The Quit India movement of 1942 had millions of ordinary people walking out of jobs and into the streets, sitting on railroads, boycotting everything British, collectively hitting unsubscribe on the machinery of imperial rule. It was nonviolence, sure, but it was anything but passive. It was stillness that broke open the system. Gandhi taught that sometimes the most powerful act is to stop cooperating, to become the immovable body confronting the unstoppable force. Their whole, if you want to get to them, "You have to get through me first" idea was louder than any rage and rippled across decades and oceans, eventually flickering across a TV screen in a small university dorm lounge in Greensboro, North Carolina, where it was about to change history again. You wouldn't know it, though. Nothing about Greensboro looks like a monumental event made for textbooks. It was just a Woolsworth, a five and dime, fluorescent lights, vinyl stools bolted to the floor, and a lunch counter. Monday, February 1st, 1960. 4 college students walked in and sat down. Ezell A. Blair Jr., Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond. What they did next was incredibly threatening. They ordered lunch. That's borderline criminal. And having been steeped in Southern manners, they asked, politely, "The nerve." In Jim Crow America, they done lost their damn minds, if you ask me. The staff refused service. After all, they were black. White customers eat, black customers don't sit. This wasn't unusual. It's a routine, a loop, constantly resetting itself. But the Greensboro Four don't protest. Instead, they do the most disruptive thing imaginable. They didn't move. No explosion, no payoff, just hours of sitting. Nothing happened. And that's the problem. What are systems supposed to do with calm refusal? Night fell. The store closed. The students left. No arrests, no headlines, just an unresolved scene. Then tomorrow came. They came back, and 4 swiftly turned into 29. By the end of the week, hundreds.
I have thought for a long time that Negroes should be allowed to sit at the counters where we are served downtown. This is just a part of many things that I think they should be allowed to do. I have felt that it really was not fair for them to be served in the stores as customers and not be allowed certain services, denied certain services within those same stores.
Black students, white students, high schoolers, college kids, people who couldn't even get a seat stood behind them, bringing the store's 2 lunch counters to a standstill. The overfill spilled into picket lines outside. That is, until bomb threats shut the lunch counters down. Indefinitely. Didn't matter. Things had already been put in motion. It was the first time someone showed how easy it was to break the loop with a simple decision not to move. Well, once people saw that, it spread. Charlotte, Winston-Salem, and Durham. Across the South, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Florida. Then beyond, New York. MLK would say what many adults struggled to accept. What is new in your fight is the fight that it was initiated, fed, and sustained by students. This wasn't respectable politics. It was disruption designed by young black organizers who understood something older movements hadn't fully embraced yet. You don't need permission to stop cooperating. I do what I want. And once that realization spread, well, it demanded structure. Of course, that's when everyone with an opinion showed up. Ugh, adults. We sure like to ruin things with rules, warnings, meetings, a whole lot of, "We love your passion." But standing slightly to the side of all that noise was Ella Baker. Baker wasn't new. She'd been building grassroots networks since the 40s as the NAACP's director of branches. This was when leadership still meant men in suits and closed rooms. After the Montgomery bus boycott in the 50s, She helped create MLK's Southern Christian Leadership Conference and served as its executive director. No big deal. So when people tell you Ella Baker was around the movement, no, child. The movement was Ella Baker. And what she saw in these students wasn't recklessness. She saw something older leaders had been trained to distrust: independence, leadership. In April 1960, Baker brought together student activists from across the South to Shaw University to ask a radical question. What if young people didn't need to be managed, just supported? I mean, to her it was simple. Strong people don't need strong leaders, which frankly was a polite way of telling adults, sit down. Out of that meeting came the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, a network, decentralized, youth-led, anti-hierarchical, suspicious of charisma, built on collective decision-making and the belief that ordinary people working together could demolish extraordinary systems. This generational shift didn't just change the blueprint of nonviolent direct action, it altered the direction of the civil rights movement. SNCC's first staff hire was Jane Stembridge, a white Baptist preacher's daughter who left graduate school to do the unglamorous work labor movements depend on, yet rarely credit: logistics, coordination, support. At the same time, organizers were attacking the system from every angle at once. Women like Evelyn Butts were quietly cracking the legal foundations of the system in courtrooms. Different fronts, same fight. And when you do that, the system does what it always does. It hits back hard. If John Lewis was still around, he could tell you. On May 9th, 1961, police stood by and watched as he was clubbed and beaten by white men for, get this, sitting in a whites-only waiting room of a Greyhound station in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Which makes absolutely no sense given that segregation on interstate buses had already been illegal for 15 years. 15! Actually, the Supreme Court had ruled against it twice. First in Morgan v. Virginia back in 1946, then again in Boynton v. Virginia in 1960, when SCOTUS basically said, okay, since y'all are pretending not to get it, yeah, we're gonna extend this to bus terminals, waiting rooms, restaurants, restrooms, all of it. Okay. Segregation in interstate travel was over. On paper, at least. In real life, the South said, absolutely not. So instead of arguing about the law like it was a Reddit thread that never ends, activists decided to test it. A Congress of Racial Equality organizer proposed something deceptively simple. If segregation was truly illegal, then integrated groups of black and white riders should be able to travel freely through the South, right? Lewis was one of the original 13 Freedom Riders recruited to try it out, traveling aboard buses from D.C. to New Orleans. Their tactics were almost boring in how precise they were. Interracial pairs sat together. Black riders took seats reserved for white passengers. Everyone else scattered throughout the bus. And just to CYA, what person would purposefully follow segregation rules so any arrests could be reported and bail arranged? The goal wasn't chaos. It was QA testing. Just, okay, if this is illegal now, let's see if anyone's actually going to enforce it. At first, they faced resistance and arrests in Virginia. Harassment, the usual. Then they moseyed over to Rock Hill, South Carolina. This is where Lewis is beaten. Another rider is arrested for using a whites-only restroom. Photos spread, and the story broke open nationwide. Before the convoy headed further south, MLK told a reporter from Jet magazine, "You will never make it through Alabama." For as much as that line still twists the knife in your side, he was right. Riders continued to Anniston, Alabama, where local authorities had already made arrangements. Surprise! They'd given the Ku Klux Klan a free window of time to attack. No arrests, no interference. One bus was firebombed. Passengers barely escaped alive. Another bus made it to Birmingham, but officers had been ordered by Police Commissioner Bull Connor to stay away. No protection, just mobs. The violence went national, then overseas. And suddenly, in the middle of the Cold War, the U.S. wasn't looking all that heroic. At that point, Corps leadership opted to pull the plug and flew participants to New Orleans. But the students, they weren't done. Under the organizing backbone of SNCC, young activists did what scared the hell out of a lot of adults. If violence was the price of enforcing the law, then they would pay for it. Not because they wanted to be martyrs, but because the country needed to see what enforcement actually looked like. On May 17, 1961, a new group of riders left Nashville for Birmingham. But just before getting there, they were immediately arrested for defying segregation laws. Bus drivers refused to carry them. Jails filled. Money ran out. Behind the scenes, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy scrambled, not out of moral clarity, but because America was getting dragged internationally. I'm not so sure I see a problem with that. RFK pressured Greyhound to find a driver, sent federal observers to accompany the Freedom Riders, and negotiated with the Alabama governor. Eventually, buses were allowed to leave Montgomery the next morning with full police escort. That is, right up to the city limits, where they were gone. The local police that had been ordered to meet them in Montgomery, they never showed up. A white mob did, though. People were beaten unconscious, some permanently injured. Federal observers were hospitalized. When the police finally arrived, they served the riders with an injunction barring them from continuing the Freedom Ride in Alabama. And yet, the rides continued. Students from across the country bought tickets to Jackson, Mississippi, knowing exactly what would happen. And you do too. I don't need to tell you. Northern students brought even more press coverage. The truth was impossible to spin. This wasn't about bus seats anymore. It was about whether the United States was willing to enforce its own laws when the people breaking them were white, local, and violent. On May 29, 1961, the Kennedy administration finally moved.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is a time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in all of our daily lives. It is not enough to pin the blame on others, to say this is a problem of one section of the country or another, or deplore the facts that we face. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality.
The Interstate Commerce Commission was ordered to ban segregation in all interstate travel facilities. By November, the ruling took effect, not because of the protests themselves, but because people had learned the lesson systems hate most. You don't need permission to stop cooperating. You can see how once the sit-ins spread, nothing stayed contained. Truth-telling started acting less like information and more like COVID. Once people realized you could say the quiet part out loud and not get disappeared, anything that depended on silence started to get real nervous. It was like someone finally unmuted the group chat. Scientists were some of the first to break ranks. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, warning that we were poisoning our own land. The chemical industry lost it, not because she was wrong, but because people were finally listening. That same year, federal troops occupied the University of Mississippi just to make sure one Black student could register for classes. Yeah. Let that sink in. Not to keep the peace, to enforce the law, which tells you everything you need to know about where the country was. And this was just the early 60s. Women were starting to ask why every version of having it all somehow required disappearing inside their own lives. Why success always came with a side order of shrinking. Latino students were organizing on campuses, pushing back against tracking, language punishment, and the unspoken assumption that they were guests in a system built on their labor. Left thinkers were tearing into old assumptions about labor, war, and who the future was actually designed for. Because clearly, it's not everyone. In rural Mississippi, Fannie Lou Hamer stitched everyday terror into the national conscience, talking about beatings, evictions, intimidation, not theory, real life. And then came Birmingham. When adults were jailed, threatened, or economically trapped, students stepped forward. Teenagers, middle schoolers, kids as young as 6 years old, skipping class to march for a future they were already being punished for inheriting. The city responded exactly as you'd expect. Fire hoses slamming children against buildings, dogs lunging at bodies half their size, authority figures unleashing violence so extreme it collapsed every remaining excuse. America had to confront something it had spent decades avoiding. The state was willing to brutalize minors to preserve order. That's not greatness. Students weren't just dismantling lunch counters anymore. They were dismantling the idea that patience is a virtue when it's only ever demanded from the people with the least power. And looming over all of this was Vietnam, a draft that made obedience personal, a system that stopped asking for loyalty and started demanding bodies. The lie that cooperation kept you safe was suddenly collapsing in real time. This wasn't about order anymore. It was about fear. The state wasn't projecting strength. It was revealing its limits. And the world saw it. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It wasn't growing pains. It was a confrontation. Then came November 1963.
A dark page in the annals of America has been written to the crack of an assassin's bullet. A nation mourns, the world grieves. The man who became 35th president less than 3 years ago is dead.
And suddenly, the decade stopped looking like a series of isolated problems and started looking like what it actually was: a country beefing with its own conscience. The ignition was complete. What began with 4 students refusing to move had become millions refusing to pretend. Stillness had turned into pressure, pressure into momentum, momentum into a reckoning. And from here on out, history would no longer whisper. It would demand an answer. Thanks for listening. This is The Persistence. I'm Angelica Cordero. History isn't just presidents and policies. It's the moments when someone quietly stops playing along, when a system expects obedience and gets stillness instead, when someone follows the rules so closely that the lie underneath them can't hold up anymore. That's what this episode has really been about. Not chaos or rebellion for its own sake, but the instant the script stops working. The sit-in, the bus ride, the student who doesn't move, the kid who keeps showing up even after everyone says, "Please stop, you're making this uncomfortable." So here's my question for you. When did your script crack? When did you realize the rules you were following weren't actually built to protect you, just to keep things running smoothly for someone else? Maybe it happened at school, or work, or in your family, or the moment you were told to wait and be patient and your body quietly went, yeah, no. If anything in this episode made you think, oh, I've lived that, I'd really love to hear it. You can share your story with us at wearethepersistence@gmail.com. And it may become part of a future episode, because history doesn't move when someone shouts the loudest. It moves when someone decides not to move at all. Our podcast was created, produced, and written by me, Angelica Cordero, with a little help from my friend ChatGPT. Immerse yourself in the captivating sounds of Fold, the UK band behind our theme song. Don't kid yourself, baby. Their music blends voices from MCs, poets, and historical speakers to amplify humanitarian perspectives and provoke deep reflections on contemporary society. Discover more at fold.fm. Props to Tamara Collins of Sunroot Studios for designing our wicked cover art that I love so much. Special thanks to those who've supported me in making the podcast, but most importantly, to my dodo bird. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and rate our feed in Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. And even better, tell your friends. Catch you next episode.